John Wesley. John Wesley, he was a preacher from the 18th century. And one day he walks downstairs and he's in his own home and he's not feeling too well. Actually, the story says he's melancholy, he's sad. He's actually feeling and looking pretty miserable. And Mrs. Wesley, his wife, because wives are so perceptive, his wife picks up on this. His wife can see that he's feeling miserable. So what she does is she goes upstairs and she dresses in all black and comes back downstairs to join him for breakfast. And he asked her, well, who died? And she said, well, God died. And he looks at her a little confused. Well, no, certainly God didn't die. Come on, what are you doing? Why are you dressed like this? And here's what she says. She says, well, I thought so. I thought God died from your countenance and your conduct. Because you look so miserable, I thought God died. I actually found this story in a book of sermon illustrations. And the idea from this story is that if we are mourning or grieving, then we don't believe in God. The idea in this story is if we're mourning or grieving or if we're sad or upset, and we don't trust that God is in charge of our lives. That's the idea here. The idea here is that Christians shouldn't mourn. And if you do mourn, if you are sad, if you do go through trials, then you're a bad Christian. Well, this is a pretty popular sentiment in today's world. This is how Christians in the West have thought and believed for many different years. And, I find it interesting that I found this idea, this story, in a book of preaching illustrations. That just goes to show that that's how we in Christianity, in the religious world, that's how we have thought. And so I did a little bit more research. I went on to Google and I typed in 2 words in the Google search box. And this is just something I do so that I can get sort of a temperature on how Americans feel. Because if you go to Google and you let the autocorrect fill in for you, well, that's typically a good indicator about how people feel. And so what I did was I went into Google and I typed 2 words. And the 2 words were never question. And then I let Google's autocorrect or auto fill in, whatever you call it, but I let it sort of, fill in the results. And the second result, I'm guessing you guys can figure it out. The second result was never question God. And so I clicked on that, and I found this quote: when we know God's heart, we will never question his will. And so again, Christianity has become this religion where people can't grieve, where grieving is looked down upon. If someone grieves, if someone is going through hard times and they're showing their grief, well, then they don't trust in God anymore. You see, Christianity has become a religion where we can't grieve. In our religious culture, we can go through turmoil. And what do we do when we go through turmoil? What do we do when we go through trials? What do we do when we're fighting depression? Well, we've got to bury it. In our culture, we can't go and run to God and lean on him. In our religious culture, we can't run to God and vent to him. We can't make our grief known. We can't run to God and beat on his chest and ask why. That's sort of the religious culture we live in today. And I think there are reasons behind this. I think one of the reasons behind this is because of one of the philosophies that undergirds our culture. In our culture, we believe that we are in control of our own destiny. And here's what this means. If we're in control of our own destiny, then if I'm grieving, whose fault is it? It's my fault. If I'm grieving, it's because I've done something wrong. In our culture, we believe we control our own destiny. If you want a good life, you do it. Just make a good life for yourself. And that philosophy has found its way, I think, into religion. And we've seen it. We call it the health and wealth gospel, right? If you do everything right, if you live a godly life, God is going to bless you in this life. He's going to give you everything you need. You're never going to go through bad times. You're never going to go through troubles. If you do grieve, then it's your fault. If you do grieve, it's because you don't trust in God. Let me just say, I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I think that's an incorrect view of grief. And I think one of the reasons that we have this incorrect view of grief is because, in modern religion and culture, we don't read our Old Testament like we should. Because the New Testament teaches us how to deal with grief as well. But the Old Testament especially, I think, teaches us how to deal with grief. I think of books like Job or Lamentations. Those books teach us how to deal with grief. And that's probably why those books, especially Lamentations, we don't read it very often because it's an uncomfortable book for us. It's a book where the poet, and personally I think Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But Jeremiah remains anonymous in the book, so sometimes I just call him the poet. And what the poet does in Lamentations is he takes us on a journey through grief, through the people's grief, through his grief. And he teaches us important lessons along the way. So what I want to do in this lesson is I want to talk about Lamentations, because Lamentations gives us a voice for our grief. So I want to look at the book of Lamentations and uncover some things that we as Christians need to understand, some things that we need to know if we're going to deal with our Christian walk, if we're going to deal with our lives. How are you guys doing today? You guys are doing well? Good. I didn't say hello like I usually did. I wanted to jump right into that John Wesley story, but I'm glad you guys are doing well. Hopefully everyone has braved the cold okay with minimal damage. And to our visitors, we're glad to have you guys as well. So Lamentations, that's where our study is going to be from. And what I want to do is I want to give you 3 lessons from the poet. 3 lessons from the poet in Lamentations. And the first lesson here is that the poet grieves. The poet, Jeremiah, God's righteous prophet, he grieves. And that's understandable. It's understandable that the poet grieves because of everything that he's going through. Let me give you some background on the book of Lamentations, and I think this will make it clearer. You don't have to understand the background to read and get something out of Lamentations, but it really does help. So let me give you some background. In the 6th century BC, Nebuchadnezzar attacks Judah, around 587 or so, a little bit before that. But Nebuchadnezzar attacks Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, and he goes through and just attacks city after city in Judah. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar makes his way to Jerusalem. And the army of Babylon surrounds Jerusalem because Jerusalem has these big walls. And, if you're an invading army, you can't just walk into Jerusalem because the walls are going to prevent you. So what the Babylonian army did was they surrounded the city, and they surrounded the city for 18 months. Now, we read that and we say, well, that's not a big deal. Okay, they were outside of the city for 18 months. But any reader in the ancient world would realize, oh, that's horrible. That's horrible. I mean, people are dying. Because the thing about if an enemy city or if an enemy army surrounds your city for 18 months, here's what that means. That means you can't bring in food. In the ancient world, farms and stuff, they weren't in the cities. They were outside of the city. So with the enemy army outside of your city, there's no way to bring in food for 18 months. And the Babylonians aren't going to just allow food to go into the city. Oh, McDonald's is here. We're going to let them in. No, they want you to starve to death. So that's a horrible situation. Food and medical supplies can't come into the city. And at the same time, trash and other stuff can't go out of the city. Again, in the ancient world, people would burn their trash and their waste and all that stuff, but they would burn it on the outside of the city, and there would be like an ash heap on the outside of the city. That's where Job was mourning, by the way. But they couldn't do that. If I had to explain it in today's terms, it'd sort of be like if we were shut up in our homes, or apartment, if you live in an apartment, shut up in our homes for 18 months, except you can't go and get food. You can't have food brought to you, no Grubhub or Uber Eats or anything like that. And you can't take trash out, can't flush the toilet or anything like that. That would quickly become very dangerous for anyone living in that house. And that's what happened in Jerusalem, in the city. So if we were living in Jerusalem during those 18 months, what would happen is we would watch our friends and our families, our mothers and fathers, sons and daughters starve to death. We would watch people literally waste away. And we would watch people die from preventable diseases because medical supplies could not be brought into the city. And if we survived all 18 months, if we didn't starve, if we survived all 18 months, we would watch the Babylonians break through the walls and come in and kill more people and come in and destroy our city and then walk into our God's house and defile God's house and destroy that as well. That's what we would see. And if we survived all of that, if we survived the 18 months, starvation, if we survived the Babylonians coming in and attacking the city, then what would happen is the Babylonians would steal us, would kidnap us, and take us on a 1,000-mile march back to the city of Babylon. That's what these people were dealing with. And it's not really something that I can put into words, but these people were grieving. They were grieving and they had questions for God. These were depressed people. And we see all of this in the book. We see all of this. We see the downfall of Jerusalem and its people. We see the despair of the poet in this book. Let's take a look. Let's look at the downfall of Jerusalem that we see in the book. Lamentations chapter 1, please. You can leave your bookmark in the book of Lamentations. I don't think we're going anywhere else in this sermon. Lamentations chapter 1. Here the poet talks about Jerusalem. And the poet describes Jerusalem as this woman who is in despair. Chapter 1 and verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan, her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Jerusalem was this once thriving city, a city filled with people, a city where people would come from all over to come and join in the festivities and the feast and the different religious holidays. And now it's an empty city. It's a desolate city. It's a city that is weeping in and of itself. And even the road mourns because the roads are empty. We see the downfall of Jerusalem in this passage. And we also see the downfall of the people. Turn to Lamentations chapter 4, please. Lamentations chapter 4, in this context, we see the downfall of the people and what they go through during those 18 months where there is no food and how they suffer starvation. Lamentations chapter 4, we'll pick up in verse 3. And what the poet is doing, what Jeremiah is doing here, is there's sort of this contrast. The animals can feed their children, but the people in Jerusalem can't even feed their children. Lamentations chapter 4, picking up at verse 3. Even the jackals offer the breast and they nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel like the ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of nursing infants stick to the roof of its mouth for thirst, for children beg for food, but no one gives to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. So here we see sort of how the people have fallen. They're hungry. They're starving to death. Even the children. You think the children will be taken care of first. Even the children are starving here. This is how much the people have fallen. Jump down a little bit to verse 9 and 10. These are some of the, in my opinion, the hardest verses to read in this book, because it just shows the despair that the people are in and some of the things that they might have been willing to do in that despair. Verse 9. Happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger who wasted away pierced by the lack of fruits in the field. So here the Jeremiah says that it would be better if you died by the sword, if you were pierced by the sword, than if you were pierced by hunger. He says it's better for you to die that way than to just wither and waste away out of starvation. I couldn't imagine being in Jerusalem and watching someone just waste away. And I imagine some of you have gone through that. Maybe you didn't watch someone waste away because of hunger, but because of their medical condition. We've seen that, right? Someone who looks so healthy, because of cancer or whatever it may be, they just waste away. And they're not themselves anymore. They don't look like themselves. They don't sound like themselves. We've seen that. Look at verse 10. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their children. They become their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. The intensity of the people's hunger. I don't know if this is hyperbole or not. I don't know what's going on here. But the point here is the intensity of the people's hunger. Look what it has driven them to do. Loving mothers. Look at what they've done. Jerusalem has fallen. This is the image that we see in this book. And because of this fallenness, we see despair. We see grief. I want to read from Lamentations chapter 3. I want to read from Lamentations chapter 3. It shows the poet's grief because he can see all this and he has heard about all of this. Lamentations chapter 3. Starting at verse 1, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me. He's talking about God. I'm under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. The idea the prophet is saying is God, he's not stopping. Just pounding me into the ground. God hasn't stopped. Over and over again. He has made my flesh, verse 4, and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with blocks of stones. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become a laughingstock of all the people, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in the ashes. And so here the poet describes everything that God has, he feels anyway, that God has done. It's like God hasn't stopped. He just keeps going through trouble after trouble after trouble. And now in verse 17, he starts to tell how he feels a little bit. My soul is bereft of peace, and I have forgotten what happiness is. He says, I don't even remember happiness anymore. Verse 18, so I say, my endurance has perished. Have you ever gotten to that point where you just say, I can't do it anymore? My endurance, I don't have it anymore. That's where the poet is at. He says, my endurance has perished, and so is my hope from the Lord. He looks around at everything going around, and he says, where is the hope? Seems like that's what he's asking God. Where is the hope? So the poet is grieving here, and he has some questions for God. He has some difficult questions for God. Jump to the last chapter, please. Chapter 5. Lamentations chapter 5, we'll pick up in verse 17. For this our heart has become sick. For these things our eyes have grown dim. For Mount Zion lies, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. So we're sick because of what happened to Jerusalem. And he says in verse 19, but you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. And that seems sort of like a positive note in the book. He says, you reign forever. Your throne endures for all generations. But why? If you rule forever, if your throne endures for all generations, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? See, out of his grief, the poet has questions for God. Why have you forgotten us? Why have you forsaken us? The poet grieves and the poet questions. So what are the lessons for us here? I've got two lessons under this point. First of all, it's okay to grieve in question. That's what the poet does. You know, like I said earlier, there are religious people who say, no, Christians can't grieve. If you grieve, you don't really trust in God. If you grieve, you're not a true Christian. And that's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it's led to a Christian culture that doesn't know how to deal with their grief. Right? And it's not just the Christian culture that doesn't know how to. We live in a culture that doesn't know how to deal with grief. We're one of the most blessed cultures, I think, in human history. But look at suicide rates and how they're continuing to climb. People don't know how to deal with grief. It's because we live in a world that says you can't grieve, you shouldn't grieve. And that's what we in Christianity, that's starting to change. Thank goodness. That's starting to change. But over the last hundreds, 300-400 years, we've lived in a Christianity where we've told people, no, you cannot grieve. Sometimes we sound a lot like Job's friends in the book of Job. I'm not going to go there this morning, but that's how we sound sometimes. Lamentations gives us a voice for our grief, and it teaches us that grieving, it's okay. And it's okay to ask, why is this happening? It's okay to ask God that. Why is this happening to me? Because the poet does that. Jeremiah does that, and he was righteous. He grieved, and he asked. That's what we see here in this book. So, it's okay for us to grieve. The second lesson that we learn from this point and in Lamentation is that even righteous people grieve. Yes, it's okay to grieve, but even righteous people grieve. In the book of Lamentations, it's clear that the people are suffering because of their own sin. That's clear. Jeremiah makes that clear over and over again. This is happening because God is judging us because of sin, because of our nation's sin. But notice with me, not everyone who is suffering God's judgment were sinful, unrighteous people. Jeremiah, the author of Lamentations, who I think authors Lamentations, he's a righteous man, isn't he? He's God's prophet. He's a righteous man, and he's suffering with the rest of Jerusalem. I think of Daniel and his three friends. Daniel, we're not told one negative thing about him at all, ever in his story. Daniel is righteous, but he's suffering. He was brought on that 1,000-mile journey to Babylon with the rest of the Israelites. He was suffering along with them. Even righteous people grieve, because sometimes righteous people get swept up into God's judgment against the wicked, and that's what we see here. So I think this book teaches us it's okay to grieve, and even righteous people grieve. Yes, we should grieve when we're wicked, but there are going to be times where we grieve when we're righteous as well. So that's the first thing that we see in the book. The first thing we see is that the poet grieves. Another thing that we see is that God is silent. It's interesting. This book is different from the other prophets because God doesn't speak at all in the book. In the prophets, we typically are hearing the very words of God. Aaron made that clear in the Wednesday night text talk. The very words of God. These are the words that came to Joel or that came to Isaiah or came to whoever it may be. And then they give you God's direct words. And we don't see that at all in this book. And it's interesting to me, the Jews actually didn't classify this book as a prophetic book. They classified this book with the Psalms and the Proverbs. It was their classification. Their classification was called the writings. We would call that the wisdom literature, but they called it the writings. And that's where they put this book. So this book is just different because God is seemingly silent. And what this means is that the poet did not get his answer. God did not answer the poet, at least not in the book of Lamentations. And we see this at the very end of the book. The very end of the book, we're going to read the last 4 verses or so, chapter 5 and verse 19. Chapter 5 and verse 19, the poet says, "But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. So why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourselves, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us, and you remain exceedingly angry with us." And those are the last words of the book. So in your opinion, just sort of reading through, does this book end on a high note or a low note? It ends on a low note, doesn't it? And the ending of the book is like this statement, but it's almost like a question. Are you angry with us? Have you rejected us? Are we still your people? Are you still our God? Have you given up on us? That's the question that the poet and many other people in Jerusalem would have after seeing the temple destroyed, seeing their way of life and their way of worship just be done away with. Are you still our God? Do you still care for us? That's the question that people would have. And in the book, God doesn't answer. He doesn't answer their question. And I think there's a hard but important lesson for us. And that is sometimes God doesn't want the answer. God doesn't answer the questions that we want answered. Again, difficult lesson. But sometimes we don't get the resolution or the closure that we want. You know, sometimes we're hurting and we have questions for God, and God never answers those questions. And you know what? That's okay. Some of the Jerusalemites had to go through that. The poet in the book of Lamentations had to go through that as well. They didn't get their questions answered. And well, the same is true of us. And again, it's okay to have questions. It's okay to run to God and to bang on his chest and ask why. But it doesn't mean that we're going to get the answer that we want. So one of the lessons we see from God being silent in this book is sometimes we just don't get the answers to our questions. But another lesson that we learn is that sometimes our lives get hard and they just stay that way. Sometimes we walk into the storms of life, we enter the storms of life, and God never takes us out of those storms. You know, there were righteous people who entered into the storms of life during those 18 months when the Babylonians surrounded the wall. And some of those people never left. They died in trouble. They died in their trials. Some of those people that had that thorn in the flesh, and it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Righteous people. There were righteous people who entered the storm and they never left. And that's true of the New Testament as well. I've already alluded to it, but it reminds me a little bit of Paul. Paul had this thorn in his flesh and he says, God, will you remove it? And Paul didn't get the answer that he wanted. God said, no, you're going to live with this. Paul had that thorn for the rest of his life. And there are some times where we enter into the storms of life and we stay there. There's some times where we have this thorn in our side and it's going to be there for the rest of our lives. Some people say, well, no, my story is going to be a Job story. Job went through all the trials and the tribulations. He lost everything. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. But you know what? He got it all back. He got it all back in this life. That's how our lives are going to be. Some people say that. But not every story is a Job story. Some people, they're like Job, and bad things happen, and they stay that way until they die. Not every story is a Job story. Sometimes we go through the storms of life, and God never brings us out of them, at least on this side of life. So the question is, where's the hope? Where is the hope? If we can't rely on God to answer our questions or remove thorns from our flesh, then where's the hope? And that brings me to the final point, and that is the poet hopes. This is a book that's filled with so much grief and despair. But there's one small section of hope. And I want to take a look at it. Chapter 3, please. Chapter 3. We're going to start reading from verse 18. And the irony is that the poet starts off by saying, there is no hope. I look around and I don't see any hope. Chapter 3 and verse 18. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed within me. So the poet starts off by saying, I look around at everything and there's no hope. I look around at what's going on in the world around me, at my life sort of crumbling down, the walls of my life falling down around me. I look at all of that. There is no hope and my soul is laid low. And then we get the but. Whenever you're reading any form of literature, you're reading the Bible, always look for the but. Verse 21. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. So in the midst of all of this grief, the poet says, this I call to mind, and therefore I hope. And what is the this that he calls to mind? It's verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. So whenever he looks around him and he looks at the walls of Jerusalem and the walls of his life falling down, whenever he looks at everything going on, he says there's no hope. But whenever he remembers God, there's hope. There's hope. You know, this section is interesting to me, and it's interesting not only because it's the only section of hope in this book, but it's interesting also because of its placement. This section of hope, verses 21 through 24 or so, this section of hope is in the very center of the book. It's in the middle chapter and in the middle verses of those chapters, or of that chapter, excuse me. This is the very center of the book. And I think that this was done on purpose. I think that the author intentionally did this. And it's like he's trying to teach us a lesson. The poet is saying that his life is centered around who God is, on the mercies of God. His life is centered around God. God is his core. And I think that's the lesson for us. Our lives must be centered around God and who he is and the hope that he brings. God must be our core. You know, we can grieve and despair. We can cry out to God in anger. We can cry out to God in agony because of the trials that we're going through. We can bring our questions to him. We can do all of these things, but at the end of the day, we've got to come back to our core. We've got to come back to the center of our lives. You know, God understands that we hurt. That's why this book is in the Bible, because God understands. He wants us to grieve. God understands that we hurt and that our lives can be filled with pain. But during those moments where we hurt and during those moments where our lives are filled with pain, we can't forget who God is. Because when we do that, that just takes us to just dangerous paths. I think of Judas and Peter. Judas grieved because of his sin. He forgot who God was. God was at the center of his life. And so what did he do? You know. Peter, on the other hand, he sinned and he grieved, but God was the center of his life. And look at the different response. And I think of Jesus. I know Jesus is an interesting example. Jesus grieved in the garden, but God was the center of his life. And look what he did. Look what he did. So even in grief, we must remember our God. And who is our God? Our God is Jehovah, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob, who is full of faithfulness and steadfast love, who is ultimately going to bring us through all of our problems. You know, I said earlier, we may stay in the storms of life for as long as we live on this earth, and that's okay. You know why that's okay? Or at least for me, I don't want to speak for you. I may stay in the storms of life for the rest of my life. That's okay. Why? Because the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. I can live in the storms of life because we as Christians, God is our core, right? Our lives are centered around him. You know, I can live with the fact that God may never deliver me in this life because I know that he is a faithful God who will deliver me in the next life. So I don't have to worry about any of that. And that is true peace, in my opinion. That's true peace. I think it's a little bit of what Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians. Whenever he tells the brothers there, we don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. We grieve, but we have hope because God is our center. And because of that, we have true peace. So let me ask, do you want that? Do you want the true peace that comes with being a child of God? Well, if that's what you want, then we can help you this morning. We can help you become a child of God through your faith, through your allegiance to Jesus, through baptism, in which we are washed and made new. We can help you. Or maybe you've left the Lord and you want to come back to the Lord because you understand that he needs to be the center of everything. You understand that it's in him that we find true hope and peace. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can do so right now as we stand and as we sing.